Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. How would you feel if one day your husband, who you'd been married to for years, mysteriously disappears? To make matters worse, everyone around you thinks that you killed him. Would you let them believe you did, or would you be determined to prove your innocence? In The Bandit Queens, set in a fictional village in India, Geeta allows people to believe she killed her abusive husband, reaping the benefits that came with her new, bolder reputation. Quite happy with her new life, things suddenly change when Geeta's neighbour, Farah, asks for help in murdering her own husband. What unravels is a super interesting, quirky, and quite fun plot steeped in dark humour. The book poses some huge questions about the structure of society, patriarchy, class, and caste systems, and what women should and have to do when they aren't listened to and institutions just don't serve or protect them. I'm so glad I'm chatting to Parini Shroff about all of these things and more today. Parini Shroff is author of the Women's Prize 2023 long-listed novel, The Bandit Queens. This is a book that the New York Times has called a radically feel-good story about the murder of no-good husbands by a cast of unsinkable women. She's a graduate of Loyola Law School and holds a MFA from the University of Texas in Austin. Her work has appeared in journals such as Southern Humanities Review, Salamander, and MacGuffin, among others. Her interests include reading in the bathtub with wine, concerts, and boxing. Hi Parini, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so lovely to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Samia. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and chat with you.
So you are a debut novelist, and your book, The Bandit Queens, was actually longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. So huge congratulations. Brilliant news. And it's just such a super interesting, really fun, but also very clever novel. And before we get into the book itself, I'm interested in knowing your backstory. What led you to writing and what led you specifically to writing this book?
I've been writing in some form or another my entire life. I think I wrote my first short story when I was 6 years old. It's framed behind me. It was called The Magic Hole. And since then, writing has always been a part of my life. I think I've gotten better at it, hopefully, but it's kind of what sustained me. And I think I was, like many authors, I was a voracious reader as a child. And there's a natural progression from consuming stories to creating your own. And that's the path that I followed. And I took some detours. I was a pre-med undergrad concentration, and then I changed my major to literature and creative writing without telling my parents. Then after I got my bachelor's in creative writing, I went to law school because I didn't know what to do. I went to law school, got a job at a law firm long enough to pay off my law school debt, and then fled to get my master's in fine arts, again in creative writing. So I feel like writing has always been a calling of mine. I just took some detours because I was trying to maybe live a life that would give me a little bit more security and stability. And now I write part-time and I practice law part-time, and that kind of balance has been wonderful because it's been able to kind of support the writing habit. And this novel in particular was born out of some loneliness in 2020 when we were all under quarantine. I was working from home like so many of us were, and I was able to kind of devote more time to this other world. Soon enough, I was consumed in it, and I wrote it faster than I've written any other manuscript of mine, because while this is my debut, thankfully, it's not my first novel. It's not my first manuscript, but it is the first one out in the world and in your hands. And for that, I'm grateful.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of authors talk about sort of like a long, winding route that ends up with them becoming an author or like a published author or a full-time writer. And I love hearing how different people's journeys are and like how they explore different things, and sometimes also do other things alongside being a writer, because we know it doesn't always pay that well, and you know it's not easy to becoming published as well. There's no guarantee that everything or anything you write will hit the bookshelves and that it will sell, which is difficult because it's art, isn't it? But I want to now talk about this particular book, The Bandit Queens. So it is set in a village in India, and it is based on a group of women, and our protagonist is called Geeta. But can you introduce it? Tell us a little bit about tell us a little bit about it.
So the novel, it's a dark comedy, and it follows Geeta, as you said. She is a woman living on her own in a village that thinks she killed her husband. She didn't. He disappeared on her 5 years ago without a trace. But it's a rumor, the rumor that she killed him. It's a rumor she works with because it proves economically advantageous for her. But then other women in the village and other women in her micro loan group, they start seeking her consulting advice because they too would like to become self-made widows, because they see the freedom looks good on Geeta and they want a slice of it. So Geeta has to decide if she's going to help them and how far she's willing to go.
So what inspired this particular story? Because it is dark humor. Like there are bits that are like very dark and really blunt, and obviously it's like women that seem to be fairly, you know, very open and very comfortable with the idea of killing their husbands. So that to me feels a bit wild. Yeah, so where did the particular idea come from?
Well, this novel started as a short story back in 2013. This was right when I quit my law firm and I had yet to start my master's program in Texas. So in that summer, I went to India because my brother and my father and all my extended family live there. And at that time, my dad was involved in financing a microloan group on the outskirts, in a village outside of Ahmedabad, which is the capital of Gujarat, which is where my family's from. So we took a day trip. My brother, my father, and I, we took a day trip to sit in on a loan meeting where these women were repaying the weekly amount that they owe back. And right away, sitting in that circle on someone's porch where they held the meeting, which makes it to the book, I heard the oath. And I knew that I was sitting in on something special. And at that point in my writing career, I was writing short stories. Longer form was very intimidating to me. I hadn't quite got there. So I wrote a short story. I wrote very numerous iterations of that short story, I think 16 drafts, and I thought it was done. Then in 2020, a friend, a dear friend, the book is actually dedicated to him, Arthur, he suggested I reread it. I did. And upon reading, I had this distance where I was able to pick it apart in a way that I hadn't been 7 years prior. I was able to say, well, what's going on here? Who's this character? Why don't we know more about them? What's the dynamic? Why do Geeta and Saloni dislike each other? Oh, it's because they have a history. And a larger world like that unfolded because I had so many questions. I kept interrogating the story that I had written, demanding more of the author, who was me. And the novel just progressed. Like it snowballed really. And the dark humor wasn't in the short story originally, but I found it creeping in, probably because I love irreverent dark humor. It is what I love to watch and what I love to read. And I kept pushing it away because the novel, though a dark comedy, it really tackles serious issues such as patriarchy, domestic violence, caste. And I thought you can't be irreverent here. Like you can take, like Parini, you can be darkly comedic in your life and that's fine, but you've got to like treat these issues with the weight that they merit. But then I realized I was editing myself before I was even writing. And I said, okay, let the novel be what it wants to be. And you can always edit later. Like we were talking about, not everything gets on the shelves, not everything gets made. And that's why it's really important to write for yourself without thinking about someone reading over your shoulder. Mm-hmm. And once I kind of released myself from what I thought it should be, the work told me what it was. And I kind of went with the comedy. And I'm so happy to hear that it works. It seems to work for readers and you. And so I'm happy.
Yeah. And I loved hearing about that because I enjoy reading short stories, but I think the thing I find so frustrating about them is that I always want to know more, especially when there's like a character whose name is like just thrown in the book, in the short story, and you're just like, well, where did they come from and who are they? And so many times I've read a short story and I have honestly felt like this deserves to be a novel. And so I think it's really special that you actually went through that journey. Was there anything in the original short story that didn't make it into the novel?
Well, as I mentioned, there were many drafts. So yes, there was an initial draft where nobody died. Farah comes to Geeta for help, but they ultimately don't do it. Then I think there was a draft where they go through with the murder, or at least the initial murder. I won't spoil. They go through with one of the murders, and then their friendship is not a friendship. But that kind of still made it into the novel, really, because there's some backstabbing and there's some duplicity, and you're not really sure of these women's motives, even amongst each other, though they are bound. Like, there is friendship, but there's also distrust and there's animosity. So it's complicated because women's friendships are complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you said, like, there are some really serious and very like heavy and weighty topics and themes that you address. One of those is the idea of justice. And I really loved thinking about that while reading the book, because fundamentally I think one of the questions that the book raises is, what do you do when you live in a world or a system where the infrastructure and the institutions fail to protect you? How do you get justice? Like, how do you keep yourself safe, and how do you know that you will be protected? It's a huge question, and I guess throughout the book that's so important because it allows us to think about whether or not the women were right in wanting to kill their husbands, and what would have happened if they didn't, and what would have happened if they had or hadn't gotten away with it. But what was exploring that like for you? What elements did you really want to bring out?
We just talked about how one of the former iterations of the short story, they didn't kill, plotted but didn't come to fruition. And I chose that because I thought, well, these are my protagonists and nobody's going to root for murder because psychopaths murder. And my dad read a very early version of the short story, and he said, you don't have to be a psychopath to be a killer, you just have to be hungry enough. And that really resonated with me. I said, okay, maybe they do go through with it. But what was the sliding scale of morality in this novel is very interesting to me as these characters' motivations. But what was more important was holding up a mirror and saying, all right, you might agree with these women's actions and taking justice, as you said, into their own hands. But what's really important is looking at what drove them there. What's really important to me is holding up a mirror and saying, well, when they're backed into a corner like this, so much so that they're just weighting the pros and cons of murder with like this clinical detachment as opposed to, the moral implications. What has driven them? Like, that is kind of a call for policy change, more so than it is a call for vigilante justice, which I have.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think because it's not just, I mean, when we say like what drove them to it, we're not just talking about the particulars of their marriages, right? We're talking about society and the police and the justice system and the courts and the caste system also. And that's very intense, and it's also really like complex. And I mean, as I think maybe because like like I have an understanding of some of these things, maybe I feel like I really grasped that, and I loved that exploration. How did you, in terms of the wider things, did you have to do research to understand that? Where did your sort of knowledge and your understanding come from?
I definitely researched particulars with respect to village life, because though I've visited many villages, and this fictional village in the novel is a composite of those places in Gujarat, I if I'm having a protagonist set there and all these characters set there, I really need to know the nitty gritty about daily life. And that meant researching the difference between caste in villages versus caste in cities. It meant researching toilets. It meant researching really like inhabiting a body in a daily life in a village in India. So there was research with respect to filling in the world, to filling in, how water wells, all the cooking, refrigerators. My protagonist wants a refrigerator, electricity, brownouts, power cuts, solar lights coming to villages, because you kind of leapfrog through technology sometimes, and they're like, okay, well, we can't rely on electricity, so now we just go straight to solar power. And in that respect, to the world building, I did a lot of research for visual and sensory details. But in terms of the characters' hearts and motivations and what they found to be failing them, that I think just came from a life lived as a woman. I think that though the novels, the characters in the novel are faced with titanic disadvantages, like as women in a village in India. And I am incredibly privileged. I'm sitting here, my home in California, in an office I have devoted to my work, which is just amazing. I have the space and time to write. But though the novel has specific problems to these women in India, it's speaking to the disadvantages of being a woman everywhere. Like, patriarchy exists everywhere. It's not an Indian problem. It's a global problem.
Absolutely, yeah.
And oppression and domestic violence, these are not limited. They're ubiquitous. And though caste is very specific to India, discrimination and prejudice is not. It's another global problem. And so I think that while the specifics of the novel are rooted, the themes are not. The themes are surround all of us. Yeah.
That's very true. I felt that while reading as well, that you could take the sort of like the skeleton almost of the characters and also of the plot, and then that could have been anywhere. It could have been anywhere where there's domestic violence happening in a marriage, or the police are not on your side and they're not listening to you. And I think that was the one of the things that screamed to me so loudly, is that women are not listened to. And I feel like I experience that almost every day in my life. Like, if when I'm at the doctor's, or even like at home, I'm telling you something and you're not listening to me, you're not valuing what I'm saying, and you're not taking me seriously enough to understand that there's a massive problem here. And that, I feel like, is a universal experience of women everywhere. So, and the other thing that you linked, I guess, to this is this concept of revenge and rage, which is different to like seeking justice. I feel like that's on like a moral sliding scale almost. But like revenge and rage, it comes from like a really deep place within you that is darker, but it's fueled by injustice, and when things are not going your way and have left you really like scarred and hurt. Where did you get that kind of fire to write that?
You have stumped me. Wow. Where did I? Stories. I think I got that rage from stories, because whether it's in the news or whether it's in fiction, you hear about this. You hear about the oppression. You hear about the violence and the getting away with it. And it's I guess I have my own rage in hearing these stories and reading them and seeing them in the newspaper and online. And then I think that rage goes somewhere. And I guess in my case, I was very fortunate that I was able to channel it into something hopefully productive and a bit entertaining, and most of all, educating. I hope it's illuminating. I hope this novel takes readers somewhere where they ordinarily wouldn't go or wouldn't know about. And like with casteism, I hope that opens some eyes and creates a larger conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I love reading about female rage, because it's so much of the time we're led to believe or encourage that anger or rage in a woman is unattractive, it's unappealing, it's unwomanly, unladylike, rubbish. It's a human emotion and experience. Like, let us feel it, and it's very valid because of everything that we go through on a daily basis, and also have been going through for so long. And I think that is part of the reason why rage is so prevalent, is because there's this frustration about when will things change. Like, when will we finally have the space to just breathe and be free and be able to lead the lives that we want to lead? But interestingly, in the book, we also explore the fact that it's not just systems and men that oppress women, but even in communities of women, we see women turning a blind eye to domestic abuse, women not helping each other, women happily throwing people under the bus. And that happens around the world. But I just wondered what you wanted to bring out about that, and why you chose to have that. Because Geeta is, at the beginning of the novel anyway, is miserable in many ways because she has been cast out from society because everyone is treating her as an outlier. Firstly, because her husband disappears, but also because she doesn't have children and she's living a life that's very different to them.
I wanted to show, I guess, both sides of the coin. When we have the animosity and the distrust between the women and the ostracization of Geeta, they're not working together and nothing is changing. And then, though begrudgingly, alliances are formed and then the women work together. And Saloni and Geeta especially have, to me, their reunion is the real love story in the novel. And things get done. Too much, arguably, gets done. And I wanted to have the foil of, like, we can be solitary. They can keep us apart. They can sow seeds of mistrust and competition and jealousy between us. Or we can reject that because that is male gaze and the patriarchy doing what it wants to do to keep us quiet and low. We could reject that, rise above it, and really accomplish things. And it doesn't have to be murder. It can be other beautiful, productive, empowering things. So the novel shows both sides of that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously I do the Geeta and Saloni friendship that emerges or like re-emerges. I think you're right, is the true love story of the book. Like, it's just so lovely that they're able to reconnect and put to bed some of the issues that they had in their past, but also understand like what they both missed, and like what had the fact that they didn't even realize what the other one was going through and doing for the other person. Just very typical, I think, experience of misunderstanding the other person.
Yeah.
But there is a sense, I think, especially when Farah comes to Geeta for help in, killing her husband, that she wants to create a better world for her children and for the next generation. But that, unfortunately, isn't what happens in many places. We still see women that are encouraging their children to marry young or do certain things that are really difficult. And I've always been really interested in this idea of how women can unknowingly hold up systems of oppression. And I say unknowingly because I don't think they do it in order to oppress somebody else. I think there's something much larger and deeper at play there. But I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I absolutely agree with you that there's inadvertent oppression simply because it's disguised as culture, and there's a lot of ignorance in terms of, marry your daughters young because they're a burden, get them out of the household so you don't have to have the burden of the cost of taking care of them. There's all sorts, but see that the system itself drives mothers to think like, this is the best thing I can do for my daughter. It feels like impossible and helpless, I'm sure, because if you can't afford to keep your daughters. And I agree with you. There is inadvertent oppression because it is not the goal, but it is a byproduct.
Yeah, I think that word, like that it is a byproduct, is really the right way that I have come to look at it as well. Because I mean, I think there are, aside from like encouraging your daughters to marry early, I think there are some really darker things that also seemingly are allowed to happen because women are allowing them to happen, like FGM in certain places, but also the rejection of domestic abuse in marriages, which means that if a woman was to leave her husband and come back to her parental home, they don't welcome her. They encourage her to go back into the arms of the violent man, and these things are huge and like very harmful. But again, I feel like it's so complex because I think because this has been going on for so many years and so many generations, there are so many women that don't understand or don't believe that moving away from these patriarchal practices is even an option, that you can live a life where you can leave a violent husband or a partner, and you can live a life where you're not getting married at 17. That shift that happens eventually, I think, comes after so many years of rage and frustration and seeking justice and seeking revenge, all of the things that you write about in the book. And I wondered how much of that came up in your like research or your writing process, if at all.
I think that what the point you just touched upon harkens back to the collective rage we feel on hearing these stories of injustice, and we carry that rage. I mean, you are a human living in the world, and it is very, very easy to feel rage at rights not given, at rights being given and then taken away. It seems impossible, and I think absolutely it was bubbling while drafting this novel, and also being cognizant of my position. It's like, what can I do? What can I really do? And I think education would be the biggest offering. Like, this novel is an offering for people, like I mentioned, to be entertained, but also to learn and to call for policy changes, because what we just spoke of, women inadvertently oppressing their daughters because it's masked as like culture and society. They feel helpless in of themselves, but if the policy changes and that stigma is removed, then there's room to maneuver. There's room to say, no, I'm not going back to my abuser. There's room to say, no, I'm not going to be married at 15, or I'm not going to marry my daughter off at 15. Because when policy changes, there's options. And hopefully when policy changes, things are normalized, like leaving an abusive household or staying in a household because you don't need to get married as a teenager. And when policy changes and becomes normalized, then you also lose the stigma of your neighbors. You don't have to worry about being ostracized like Ethan when you walk out the door, or being called names, or having your reputation seen as being mixed with dirt. That's when fruitful and progressive change can occur.
Absolutely. Oh, I loved listening to you talk about that. So interesting. And I think you're definitely right. And we see a lot of change, fruitful and progressive change in the book as well, which is really nice to read about. But one of the things that you write about is caste. Obviously, it kind of like runs throughout the book because it is the thing that almost makes up the world that you've created. I have an understanding of the caste system in India. I don't know like massively the ins and outs of it, but it has always really frightened me. And I feel like there is some version of a caste system in many places around the world, if not everywhere, because if it's not called caste, it's called class, and if it's not class, it's about sex within religious groups. Like it's fundamentally this idea of breaking down a society into groups of people that are identified by factors such as their wealth and their access to funds, essentially, I think, but other things,
their skin color.
Absolutely. And what really drove you to write so much about the caste system, and what in particular did you want to bring out?
Two things were, I think, instrumental in addressing caste, but also the creation of the character of Khushi, who is a Dalit woman in the novel. First was that I was setting the novel in a village, and it would have been unrealistic and sanitizing to eliminate the existence of caste. I didn't think, and I don't think, I was the right person to have a Dalit protagonist. That's not a voice that I feel I'm the appropriate person to have. But I thought in creating a more minor character that could serve to paint a realistic picture of a village in India and also serve to educate. The second element was it was becoming very clear that Phulan Devi, the real life Bandit Queen, was going to be a thread throughout the novel. She's a source of inspiration for Geeta and the other characters as they are discussing the merits of killing some husbands. And Phulan Devi herself was a Dalit woman in a village in India. And at that point, discussing and dissecting caste seemed not only organic, but kind of faded in the novel.
And just on the real Bandit Queen, she is an inspiration for Geeta in the book. But what about for you in writing the book?
You know, I've grown up with the story of the notorious, I'm using air quotes right now, the notorious Bandit Queen. And it's so ingrained in kind of pop culture that I don't remember a time when I first heard of the story. I don't remember a time when I didn't know about her legend. Because of that, I felt that I wanted to show her story without any judgment on my part. Like, she's an inspiration for Geeta, and she is a force. It's undeniable. And many parts of her story inspire me, but not all. I think she was a woman put in not one, but hundreds, thousands of impossible positions to make impossible choices. And speaking of rage, right? Like, her story is marked by such rage and violence that she was subjected to and violence that she herself committed. And I am inspired by her. I'm not seeking to emulate her, but then again, I was never put in any of the positions she was put in.
Exactly. And I love the fact that Geeta had a real life, almost like, I don't know, like a hero, a heroine, somebody that inspired her. But it was really interesting to see how she kept on going back to the story of the real Bandit Queen in thinking about even her own motivations. So she would go back and she would say, well, she did this act of violence because she experienced X, Y, and Z. And then when she experienced X, Y, Z, she did this. And it made Geeta reflect on how, like, almost like what steps she should take. And that was really interesting because I also love the fact that it was kind of like a story within a story. I hadn't heard about the Bandit Queen actually before, the real life one. And I looked it up after. I was really fascinated. But I have heard of, there have been kind of like the Pink Sari group that have set up in India, which I don't know if they are inspired by the Bandit Queen, but have a similar kind of revengeful and social justice kind of aim. And also that they are massively driven by rage as well. And it's all about injustices against women, which I love. So your book addresses so many different themes and issues. So we've got patriarchy, we've got domestic violence, we've got caste, but we've also got a female friendship, we've got a kind of love story in there, we've got a widower, and a potential widow. So many themes and issues. Why did you decide to include so many of these, I guess, like societal ills? And how did you make sure that you did justice to them? Because I think that you did it very well. You didn't kind of just like name drop or just like throw it in there. I feel like you explored them with the sensitivity required. And obviously, I think with any book, you know, you could have had 300 pages just about the caste system or just about the police, for example, and you just don't have that space. But yeah, so why did you decide to include so many different issues, and how did you bring justice to them in terms of how you wrote about them?
You know, it wasn't a direct choice to include these societal issues, in quotes. It was, we mentioned I was inhabiting Gita. She's living a life, her day-to-day life. And a day in the life of Gita presented all these issues. Honestly, like it's staggering how making a simple choice like going to the bathroom will go back to gender. And the difference between, men peeing in the fields and women having to go in the dawn and dusk hours to avoid harassment, to avoid their honor being questioned. And it's a simple thing, relieving your body, like a biological need would just revert back to, okay, now there's rules for men and there's rules for women. So it really wasn't a choice of like, okay, I have all these ills that I want to speak to and address. It was as these characters were just living their lives and trying to survive, the issues kept coming and the oppressions kept coming. And so it wasn't a choice. It was me describing life and all the ills floating to the top.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think one of the many feelings I had while reading the book was also this kind of like sense that it was very confronting, and what it made me reflect on was my own privilege, in the sense that if I need water, I can open a tap. I don't need to go and collect water from a communal well or whatever it may be. That then puts my life at risk, because if I don't go within certain hours, I run the risk of being attacked by somebody, or if I do go at certain hours, I'm going to be fighting with other women about getting my bucket filled. Yeah. And the same thing about like going to use the bathroom. I have one bathroom in my house, but people have multiple in their own house, and there's no issue. The very idea that your everyday life is not only difficult in terms of like practicalities as to how difficult it is, but in terms of your very own safety and your own existence, and actually like how political the personal really is.
That's so beautifully put. Yes, 140 million%. I'm just snapping right now, because yes.
Yeah, honestly, I really hope that other people are also able to reflect in a similar way, because I think one of the things about the book was that it was so incredibly readable, and I was also just itching to fly through it because I wanted to know what happened. And I felt like there were like twists and turns and like shock surprises and all kinds of stuff happening, but I was also just like, oh my goodness, what is going to happen? Like, what's going to happen at the end? And so you almost don't have, if you read it especially as quickly as I did, you don't have the same space to really reflect on it. But once I put it back, I was experiencing lots of different emotions, and this was part of it, was that not just privilege in terms of comfort, it's about like just the right to exist and the right to live safely. And this isn't just the case in a village in India. This happens to millions and millions of women around the world every single day, in smaller and bigger ways as well. So I'm really, really glad that you wrote about it so well as well. Now, I'm very interested in how you decided the ending of the book. Now, I try not to give away spoilers on this show, so I don't really know how we're going to address this question without talking about the ending. But did you consider alternative endings, and how did you decide on this specific one?
It's like you're peeking into my brain. Yes. The last 2 chapters of this novel took as long as the entire rest of the novel to write. Like I think there are 30 chapters. 28 of those flew out of me in a matter of months. And the last 2 took just as long. It was the bane of my existence. But it kind of, looking back on it, it's kind of a nice, and maybe nice is not the wrong word, it's a fitting bookend, because as I mentioned, the short story had 16 versions before I thought the short story was done. The final 2 chapters had close to 16 versions until my agent and editor, we all were satisfied. But every time I knew it wasn't working, I'd go back to, the last time I knew it was working or I felt it was working, and then try again. So there are some, I feel like maybe I should go back and look at some of the stuff that's on some of the scraps that didn't make it, because I did try a bunch of different endings, and it, through the process of elimination, we got there. But it was, the ending was the hardest part, because, there's this mess you create, and then you're like, okay, I have all these strings in the air. How do I resolve them in a satisfying way for the reader? Because a person picks up a book, there's like this contract of sorts between the author and the reader. It's like my job to take you on this journey, and it's my job to uphold my end of the bargain and satisfy you. And if I don't, then it's like, you spent all these hours trusting me, and what did I do to you? So the ending was absolutely laborious, but we got there.
So I thought the ending was very good in the sense that we did have a lot of like threads that were loose, and you kind of tied them up into a bow, or like a semi bow, giving us a lot of sort of like, we could see maybe what might happen for each of the characters going forwards, and there's hope, and there's, some good stuff. And then there's the topic of Geeta's husband, which again comes back to this idea of like revenge and justice, and people getting their just desserts. Now, but I'm not sure that he got his just desserts. Did you think about maybe a different form of, I don't know, outcome or revenge for him in particular? Like, because I hated that character. Like, I hate him because of everything that he did, but also everything that he symbolizes. Like, he symbolizes so much that is wrong with the world, in just one character. And so I really, I had this real hatred for him inside. And I was so desperate for Geeta to be able to live the life that she wants to live, but also because throughout the book I was like, this woman is really wonderful. Like, she's so intelligent, but she's also really very emotionally aware and very socially aware, but she's so clever. She's just so clever. And so I really wanted her to, be free of the oppression and the sort of the violence as well that he was bringing into her life. I'm not sure that he got the right. I don't know if it was bad enough or bad in the right way. I just wonder with him in particular what your thoughts are.
It was really important to me to have the epilogue, and because of the conversation in the epilogue, I needed to end Ramesh a certain way, to leave Ramesh a certain way, and that conversation that Geeta has. And again, this is very difficult without revealing too much, but her chance to talk, I think that's all. But the second thing I will say is that I am not entirely sure that is the end to Ramesh's or Geeta's story.
That's an interesting plot twist. Are you working on the Bandit Queens too?
I have not. I will be honest. I have not written one word of the Bandit Queens 2, but I have imaginary conversations with them on a daily basis, and I hope to write them down soon.
Good. I hope you do too. And I think, the thing is, the way that you left it, anything can happen, and I really felt that reading your book as well, just anything could just happen, because of that, things just change course quite quickly, and especially for Geeta, because she's in a position where kind of it feels like in many ways the world is her oyster, which is really great. So I really hope that, I would love it if we had the Bandit Queens too. What was your favorite part of writing the book?
Do you mean a particular chapter or scene?
Yeah, or maybe a character, or
I loved writing Saloni. She's my favorite, and the comedy between her and Geeta really crackled. I would write that dialogue at a rapid fire pace, and to the point where it looked like a play or a screenplay, and then I'd have to go back and fill in the world and be like, all right, where are they sitting? What's the blocking? what are the senses, right? What does it smell like? What does it look like? But because their voices were just like flying out of my head. And a moment ago, I was speaking about dialogues in my head. Geeta and Saloni won't shut up. I don't want them to shut up. I love them, but they won't shut up and they won't leave me alone. So their chemistry really was a treat to write. And in a particular scene, there is a moment when Geeta, Saloni, and the twins, Preeti and Priya, are in a room with some evidence, some bloody evidence they're trying to figure out what to do with. There's some dark comedy there because while they're trying to dispose of this evidence, there's also misunderstandings and accusations and insults flying. And those women in that room together was such a treat to write. I thought it was the humor like kind of created itself, and I hope that comes across, like the joy I had, especially on the heels of something really serious happening.
That scene is probably one of my favorite in the book for that reason, because just like something absolutely awful has just happened, but then the twins fall out over something that feels so petty.
Yeah.
It's just so funny because for them it's also this like huge realization that if something seemingly massive happened to them, it's happened to one of them, especially in their childhood, and she feels completely done by. But it was also just kind of, it just felt almost like I could see it on a stage, like on a play, as being kind of like a comedic play, but it was also something so serious and like, you know, people could have gone to jail, like it was very dangerous. But yeah, I absolutely love that too. In terms of, so obviously the book does have a lot of dark comedy. Do you consider yourself a funny person?
I feel like everybody does, but yes, I do consider myself a funny person. I use humor as like a survival technique on a daily basis, and as many of us do. And it's just life can be macabre and funny. It's very unrealistic to sanitize comedy out of life because yes, shit happens, but timing can be funny and irony is everywhere. And so yes, I do. I think I'm funny.
And do you think if you were to write another novel, you would always have an element of humor?
The project I'm working on right now. Yeah, the project I'm working on right now, which is not a sequel to the Bandit Queens, does have the dark comedy element. Yes, I think it hasn't always been in my writing. The manuscripts I wrote and the short stories I wrote prior did not have this tone, but having discovered it, having found this muscle that I hadn't used but am now exercising, feels good. So yes, it is where I am right now.
So as someone who didn't go immediately to becoming a writer, either full or part-time, do you have any advice or words of inspiration for anyone who is wanting to enter the world of authorship and writing, but is either not sure or they're holding themselves back and they don't know where to start?
Well, my advice for starting is slightly different than the advice I usually give writers, which is keep going, because so often this road is paved with rejection because there are necessary gatekeepers. But you have to keep going because these stories are important. And arbitrary lines of what is marketable does not mean that your story is not either worth telling or needs to be heard. And thankfully, we're in a time when there's many avenues. There's not just the traditional avenue to publishing, and that's a beautiful thing. So typically my advice is to keep going. For starting, now that is trickier because it's different for everybody. For me, I start with a character I find particularly compelling, and then that character gets into situations. That's just how I start. Plenty of people successfully start from other places. So my advice would be very take it with a grain of salt, really. And I would say start with a character. Start with a character who intrigues you, and then put them in crisis or put them in a conflict.
I think what you said about the sort of like arbitrary lines with regards to marketability of books and getting published is like a really difficult thing that a lot of authors come up against. And I think it's fair for me to say, for a lot of South Asian female authors in particular, what has your experience been like? And was your writing or your novel kind of like policed or changed in any way?
Well, the journey here has been many no's on some of my other manuscripts. Some of the nicest no's I've ever encountered. Nice to the point where I'm like, wait, did you really just say no? Wait, what's happening? This is so flattering, but no. And then this one, thankfully, I think many editors or houses saw the potential for a really wide audience, and that was new to me, so I appreciated it. I was like, I don't know what I did, but okay, I'll take it. And in terms of the actual this manuscript, I'm very fortunate. My editors loved the story as is, and though, as I mentioned, we had to finagle the ending, we had to work, there was a lot of back and forth on that. They really trusted that I had edited and revised many times before it even got to them, and they could see that. I think one of the kindest things my editor told me, she said, until we get to the last 2 chapters, it's seamless. And I thought, wow, what a chef's kiss. Thank you. They could see the work that I put into it. And so, no, there were minor notes for consistency and motivation and that, but nothing big. And I'm grateful to that, because you hear a lot of stories that are not like that they are, editors are very pushy and very certain that a certain plot point or a certain action on a protagonist's part cannot fly. And I was very grateful that I didn't have that kind of hand insisting on its own way. It was left to do what felt organic to me and the characters.
That's good. It does sound like a really nice process, I guess, if that's the right word to use, but also just like speaking to this entire conversation, like, I mean, I read a book that's 300 pages, but it sounds like you probably wrote like 3,000 pages, and editing and all kinds of stuff, like a huge amount of work. And that insight, I feel like, is also really important, alongside the fact that this wasn't just a novel wasn't the first thing that you wrote ever and then got published. Like you've had a journey that has been marked with some no's as well, which is really, I think, important for anyone who is aspiring to be an author to be aware of, and also to not feel alone when there are disappointments along the way.
Yeah, it's set up, the whole process is set up for, I kind of think of it, it's actually akin to law school for me. I think like law school has so many hurdles to becoming a lawyer that they kind of are like, you're not in it, you're not devoted, this process is probably going to separate you. It's probably going to leave you behind because it's just too arduous. Like you have the LSATs, and then you have applications, and then you have law school, and then you have the bar exam. It's like endless. So is a publication. It feels like you get a lot of rejections when you submit short stories to journals. You get a lot of rejections when you query literary agents. Then if you're fortunate enough to be represented, then you get a lot of rejections when the manuscript goes out to editors at houses. And then even after all that, people might not like it. You might get reviews. The internet is a strange place. I'm not even talking about trade reviews from, journals and magazines. I'm talking about people on Goodreads, on Amazon, who are very willing to share, their opinions. And so the rejections, it's never going to end. That's just the process of creating anything and putting it out there and being vulnerable. But we can't let that stop us, because where would we be without these wonderful offerings? So yeah, you'll definitely, I mean, as an artist, you should retain your sensitivity, because it makes what you're representing through your lens so unique and wonderful. But you'll also develop kind of like a shrug to some of these rejections. You'll be like, all right, next, let's move on.
Yeah. That's really insightful, and I hope will be very helpful to everybody listening to this right now. So thank you so much, Parini, for your time today. It has been so wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a true delight.
Thank you so much to Parini for such a fun and interesting conversation. I loved every second of it, and honestly, I absolutely loved the book too. I hope you who are listening also enjoyed it and that you reached for a copy of The Bandit Queens. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.